Have you ever felt yourself edging toward madness from the endless need to pretend, smiling while every nerve inside screams for release? That quiet ache seeps into every breath, growing heavier each time the words, "I'm fine," escape your lips. Psychology calls it emotional dissonance, but the hated child knows it by another name, survival. It is the mask worn so tightly it feels like skin, a mask that trembles with every heartbeat, a mask that carries a story no one has dared to hear. And perhaps this is the moment to lean closer, to listen more carefully. Because when the hated child's performance begins to crack, what breaks through is not weakness, but the truth that was buried all along. We'll go beyond the surface of pain to uncover what it really means to grow up as the hated child. You'll understand why rejection in childhood leaves marks that never fully fade, how those hidden wounds shape your thoughts, your trust, and your relationships today. Most importantly, you'll see that these scars do not have to define your future. Step by step, we'll explore the signs, the struggles, and the first paths toward healing. From that ground of small but repeated wounds, another layer of harm begins to grow, one that seeps beneath the surface and lingers long after the moments have passed. A child who is met again and again with cold eyes, sharp sighs, or the heavy silence of withdrawal, begins to feel like an intruder in their own home. They sit at the table, listening to the scrape of a chair pulled back too hard, watching a parent's face tighten with irritation, waiting for words of comfort that never come. In that silence, they are named without words. The hated child. In such moments, the child does not merely feel unloved, they begin to believe they are unlovable. It is not only the absence of warmth, but the presence of disdain, as if their very existence is an inconvenience. Each unanswered cry, each look of disgust, each night spent clutching a pillow instead of being held, writes the same sentence on their skin. You are the hated child, too loud, too needy, too much. Over time, this belief sinks in like ink on paper, hardening into a script. I am unwanted. I am the hated one, before I even begin. This is the hidden inheritance carried forward. The hated child learns to shrink their voice, to walk softly, to scan every face for signs of irritation. Home becomes a stage where every gesture must be measured, every word rehearsed, because rejection feels inevitable. And even when they grow, even when childhood is long behind them, the echo lingers, the nervous laugh in conversation, the retreat from intimacy, the restless nights where the body still braces for punishment. The tragedy is that this weight does not come from who the hated child truly is, but from the environment that branded them with shame. They were not born despised, they were taught to carry that name. To recognize this truth is to loosen the grip of that old script, to begin to separate the essence of the self from the rejection imposed upon it. And from that recognition comes the fragile but real possibility of rewriting the story, of discovering at last that being the hated child was never destiny, only the shadow cast by another's wound. Because children see their parents as reality, they blame themselves when they are rejected. Before they can name the feeling, the thought takes root. If the people who gave me life turn away, the fault must live inside me. In that moment, the child becomes the hated child. The label spreads like ink in water, unseen but unstoppable. If love is withheld, surely it must be because the hated child is unworthy. This is the cruel inheritance of rejection. The hated child lies awake at night, doubt curling like smoke, whispering, "Am I too much? Am I not enough? Will I ever be wanted?" These questions trail into classrooms, into friendships, into first romances. Each silence, each pause, each closed door feels like proof. I am the hated child. Comparisons sharpen the wound. A smile given to a sibling, a word of praise for another, a sigh of disappointment aimed at them. The message is clear. The hated child learns daily that affection has a scale, and they always weigh the least. The family table becomes a tribunal, every glance a verdict. They do not just feel overlooked, they feel despised, carrying the name like a scar. So the hated child begins to perform. They polish words, hide tears, chase perfection as though it were a key, yet the door remains locked. Each attempt deepens the script. Try harder, doubt deeper, ache longer, and beneath it all lives the same unspoken plea. If I become everything you want, will you finally stop hating me? This silent cry follows them into every corner of life, and it is here the question emerges: how does this hidden identity shape the adult they later become? Research shows that parental rejection is linked to low self-esteem, anxiety, and altered brain function. The amygdala, the watchtower of fear, grows restless, while the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, falters. Yet long before these changes appear in the adult brain, they are etched in the body of the hated child. Imagine a small figure waiting at the edge of a room, eyes searching for a smile that never comes, shrinking under a sigh that feels heavier than words. But what does this mean for the adult who once stood there, hoping to be chosen? It means stepping into life like a soldier on unfamiliar ground, always scanning the horizon for threats, always bracing for the sound of breaking trust. A single word, a delayed text, a closed door. Each can feel like a battlefield. To be hypervigilant is to live in a house with no doors, only windows that let in every gust of doubt. To overreact to small things is not weakness, but the echo of nights when the hated child felt like an intruder in their own home. Rejection, planted in early soil, grows into vines that twist around choices, sometimes choking, sometimes merely clinging. How could one not feel fragile when the very foundation of belonging was cracked by the belief, I am the hated child, and nothing I do will be enough? The tragedy is that this storm rarely shows its cause. Outwardly, the adult may smile, achieve, even shine. Inwardly, the mind trembles at shadows no one else can see. The brain, molded by disdain and absence, tuned to threat, becomes a harp that plays the same fearful song. And yet, beneath the dissonance, there is still a yearning melody, the longing to be safe, to be known, to be held without condition. Is it possible to unlearn the language of rejection? Can a heart that once shrank under contempt relearn to stay open? Healing begins where the pain began, in relationship. With patience, tenderness, and repetition, the nervous system can learn another rhythm. Slowly, the amygdala quiets, the prefrontal cortex strengthens, and the storm breaks into light. But the journey is not quick. It is circular, not linear. It asks for courage, persistence, and compassion, turned inward as much as outward. And so the adult who grew up as the hated child becomes both survivor and seeker. Survivor of an old script etched with disdain, seeker of a new story where worth is not conditional, where love is not rationed like punishment. The question remains, will they keep living as guardians of past wounds, or dare to step into connection? Perhaps the answer lies not in erasing the past, but in carrying it differently, no longer as a chain, but as a lantern. And if a lantern can be carried, it will surely cast light on what comes next, revealing paths that once seemed hidden in the dark. Many hated children develop coping strategies, perfectionism, people-pleasing, or rebellion. What looks like choice is often survival. What appears as personality is often a shield. A child who learns that love is conditional may try to earn it by shining flawlessly, by pleasing endlessly, or by resisting fiercely. Yet beneath each mask lies the same cry of the hated child. Will I be safe if I am simply myself? Perfectionism becomes the armor of the hated child, polished day after day, gleaming outward, yet unbearably heavy within. People-pleasing turns into a dance of endless yeses, a choreography that trades authenticity for acceptance. Rebellion, though louder, is no less fragile. It is the flame that declares I cannot be controlled, yet burns from the same fuel of rejection. 3 paths, 3 disguises, 1 wound. The wound of being the hated child. As these strategies stretch into adulthood, they shape lives in ways both subtle and consuming. Overwork is praised in modern culture, yet often it is the hated child still striving to prove worth again and again. Fear of failure lingers like a shadow, whispering that any mistake will confirm unworthiness. And the lack of trust toward others, toward life, even toward oneself, becomes the invisible wall that blocks the intimacy most deeply desired. Are these strategies truly who we are, or only scaffolding built by the hated child to survive? To ask this question is to stand at a threshold. To recognize the armor as armor, the dance as performance, the flame as cry, is the beginning of freedom. Healing does not demand erasing defenses, but teaching the adult to set them down. And beyond that threshold lies the quiet mystery. When the disguises fall, what self might finally step into the open air? Rejection can hide behind a familial facade of normality, a home where meals are shared and polite words are spoken, yet the hated child feels an absence that no ritual can mask. Curtains are drawn, the floor is swept, and smiles appear for visitors, but within those walls lies a silence more wounding than open conflict. What could be more confusing than being told you are loved while every gesture whispers you are unwanted? What could be more disorienting than laughter that sounds hollow, affection that flickers, and tenderness that cuts like indifference? Here is where self-doubt takes root. The hated child begins to question not just the family's love, but their own senses. Did it really happen? Was the coldness imagined? Gaslighting does not always come with cruel words. It often comes with denial of what the child already feels. And when the hated child is taught to mistrust their own heartbeat, their inner compass begins to fracture. How can one navigate the vast sea of life when the very needle of direction no longer points true? This unhealed pain does not remain in childhood. It travels forward, carried in silence, wrapped in invisibility. The hated child becomes the adult who struggles in marriage where love feels conditional. They become the friend who hesitates to trust, the parent who, despite deep resolve, sometimes echoes the very wounds they once received. The cycle repeats like a haunting refrain. Control that suffocates, withdrawal that chills, affection that flickers. 3 faces, 3 echoes, 1 wound. Still the wound of the hated child. Yet is this repetition destiny? Must the hated child remain bound to shadows? Perhaps not. Healing begins in the quiet act of naming what was once denied, in unmasking the facade, in daring to see the wound clearly. It demands courage to face, tenderness to accept, and grace to move forward. And maybe the truest sign of healing is this: when the echoes no longer dictate the song, when the silence begins to hum with possibility. What grows in that silence is not yet clear, but it is enough to hint that another chapter is waiting to be sung. High alertness can turn into empathy and intuition, what begins as vigilance in the hated child. Ears straining for the shift in tone, eyes scanning for the slightest shadow, can, with time, become a rare gift. The same child who once trembled at footsteps learns to read the silent language of others, to sense what is unspoken, to notice what most overlook. Is this not a paradox? That the wound can sharpen perception, that the scar can become an antenna? Many artists, many leaders, many healers carry within them the story of the hated child. Alienation becomes the soil where imagination grows. Silence becomes the canvas where new visions are painted. Longing becomes the fire that fuels compassion. Again and again, history shows us. Pain does not always harden into bitterness. Sometimes it refines. Sometimes it deepens. Sometimes it transforms. 3 paths, 3 fruits, 1 hidden root. The root of being the hated child. Yet transformation is not simple. For every work of art created, there is a night of doubt endured. For every act of leadership, there is an echo of the old whisper, "Am I enough? Am I still the hated one?" What shines on the outside often carries shadows on the inside. And still, within this tension, possibility stirs. Perhaps the deepest wisdom is born not in spite of the wound, but through it. So the story bends toward a new horizon. If the hated child can grow into an adult who turns alienation into connection, then rejection does not have the last word. What remains to be explored is how this alchemy unfolds, not only in art or leadership, but in the ordinary rhythm of relationships, in the daily practice of choosing to love differently. Key actions include journaling about the rejected memory with affirming truths, building supportive or therapeutic relationships, setting healthy boundaries, being creative in expressing yourself, and practicing daily self-kindness. For the hated child, now grown, these practices are not shallow rituals. They are seeds planted in once barren ground, slow gestures of reclamation in a landscape that once felt unlivable. Journaling becomes more than ink and paper. It is the hesitant hand of the hated child, writing what was long unspeakable. I was unseen, I was diminished, I was worthy all along. Each phrase untangles an old knot. Each paragraph opens a window. Silence turns to testimony. Shame becomes story. Memory becomes meaning. Supportive relationships form another pillar. For the hated child, trust feels like a foreign language. Unfamiliar sounds, uncertain grammar. To step into a friendship, a partnership, or the safety of therapy is to test whether rejection will strike again. Yet in the steady presence of those who listen without judgment, the nervous system learns another rhythm. Safety becomes more than theory, it becomes felt experience. And in these moments, the hated child discovers that connection can be chosen, built, sustained. Boundaries carry their own quiet power. The hated child once bent to every demand, contorted to fit the shape of others' approval. To say no now is to claim existence. Boundaries do not build prisons, they draw maps. They do not shut out life, they make space where life can grow freely. Creativity provides another path. The feelings once too raw for words can take shape as color, sound, movement. For the hated child, creation becomes alchemy. Sorrow transforms into song, rage into rhythm, longing into light. Through expression, rejection is no longer weight but material for beauty. And daily self-care-ness becomes the soil where all else can take root. For the hated child who learned only criticism, small mercies matter. Choosing rest without guilt, offering compassion to mistakes, honoring needs without apology. Each gentle act strengthens inner ground. Each pause builds stability. Each breath of acceptance nourishes resilience. These practices cannot erase the past, but they reshape its echoes. They turn survival into resilience, silence into testimony, absence into presence. And perhaps most of all, they ready the heart for what has yet to arrive. What might unfold from this soil, what fragile shoots, what unseen blossoms, remains uncertain. But the air is shifting, the earth is stirring, and a new season waits just beyond the horizon. Key actions include journaling about the rejected memory with affirming truths, building supportive or therapeutic relationships, setting healthy boundaries, being creative in expressing yourself, and practicing daily self-kindness. For the hated child, now grown, these are not shallow rituals. They are seeds pressed into soil once thought sterile, gestures of reclamation in a landscape long abandoned. Journaling becomes more than marks on paper. It is the hesitant hand of the hated child finally daring to write what was silenced. I was unseen, I was diminished, I was worthy all along. Each phrase unknots an old cord. Each paragraph lets in a breath of air. Silence becomes testimony. Shame becomes story. Memory becomes meaning. Supportive relationships form another pillar. For the hated child, trust feels like a tongue half forgotten. To enter friendship, partnership, or the safe space of therapy is to step across fragile ground, wondering if it will hold. Yet in the presence of patient companions, the nervous system learns another rhythm. Safety shifts from theory to felt experience, and slowly, the hated child discovers that connection can be chosen, built, sustained. Boundaries bring their own quiet revolution. The hated child, once bent, twisted, yielded to survive. To draw lines now is to sketch a new map of existence. A boundary says, here is where I end and you begin. It is not a fortress, but a shoreline. Meeting place of tide and land, limit and possibility. 3 gestures, 3 affirmations, 1 truth. Dignity reclaimed. Creativity opens yet another door. The emotions once too raw for speech spill into paint, melody or movement. For the hated child, creation is river and fire and sky. Sorrow flows into song, rage beats into rhythm, longing lifts into color. Expression transforms rejection into art, isolation into dialogue, pain into presence. What once was burden becomes offering. And daily self-caredness lays the ground where all else takes root. For the hated child, schooled in criticism, even the smallest mercies matter. Rest without guilt, patience toward failure, compassion for imperfection. These repeated acts form an inner architecture, steady beams holding what once collapsed. Such practices do not erase the past, yet they alter its resonance. They turn survival into resilience, silence into testimony, absence into presence, and most of all, they prepare the heart for what lies ahead. What rises from this soil, what blossoms, what branches, what fruits, cannot yet be seen. But the earth is stirring, the season is shifting, and something long awaited is moving toward the light. Healing means moving from victim to creator, integrating the pain while choosing a life of connection and self-acceptance. Yet for the hated child, this shift does not arrive easily. They stand at a threshold where the air is thick with memory, where each step stirs echoes of rejection. How does one cross into new ground when the old ground still trembles beneath the feet? How does one claim creation when life began in the shadow of dismissal? And yet, the burden that once bent the back can, when carried with awareness, become the stone on which a new foundation is laid. For the hated child, the journey begins with recognition. They must look directly at the mirror of the past, naming what was denied, allowing the unspeakable to be spoken. To whisper, "I was the hated child," is to break a long silence, to reclaim breath, to open a door long locked. Naming is not condemnation, it is illumination. It separates wound from worth, declaring that pain is real, but self is more. From there, creation stirs. What was endured in secrecy begins to take shape in expression. The hated child learns to give voice to ache, to carve sorrow into song, to paint the absence with color. Pain that once suffocated becomes clay in their hands, malleable, transformable, capable of becoming something unexpected. Silence becomes story. Shame becomes strength. Memory becomes meaning. 3 turns, 3 transformations, 1 possibility. To make art out of anguish. Yet creation alone is not enough. Connection calls. For the hated child, trust feels fragile, as if every bond is glass that might shatter at the smallest touch. They approach intimacy with trembling hands, bracing for betrayal. And yet, in the warmth of chosen family, in the patience of true friends, in the presence of communities that do not demand perfection, a new belonging emerges. Not the brittle bond of blood, but the chosen bond of spirit. Chosen love, chosen loyalty, chosen presence. Each act a defiance against the verdict once given. You are unwanted. In these connections, the hated child discovers belonging is not bestowed from above, but woven thread by thread in daily gestures of care. A meal shared, a hand held, a word spoken without judgment. Each proves rejection was never the final truth. And within these simple acts, something extraordinary takes root. The hated child, once outside every circle, steps inside a circle they helped create. But perhaps the deepest challenge is self-acceptance. For the hated child was trained to shrink, to see the mirror as enemy, to stand unguarded, to breathe without apology, to declare, "I am enough." This is quiet revolution. Self-acceptance is not denial of scars, but integration of them, not pretending the wound never existed, but carrying it as part of the story. To embrace oneself is to reconcile with the hated child within, extending a hand, not in contempt, but in compassion. And so healing is not the erasure of pain, but its transformation. It is the weaving of fragments, the gathering of scattered pieces, the choosing of life not once, but again and again. Healing means moving from victim to creator, integrating pain while shaping something new, choosing a life of connection and self-acceptance. Belonging, then, is no longer a distant horizon, but a present possibility. It is found in chosen family who offer steady presence, in communities that hold rather than harm, in relationships where acceptance is not rationed but freely given. For the hated child, this belonging does not erase the past, but it proves the past does not dictate the future. The old script can be rewritten, the old verdict overturned, the old shadow dispelled. And perhaps the clearest sign of healing is this: what was once rejection becomes resilience. What was once isolation becomes intimacy. What was once silence becomes song. The hated child, once unseen, becomes the creator of a new life. And in that creation lies the promise, not of perfection, but of belonging that endures.